Right now, President-elect Donald Trump is meeting with former presidential candidate Mitt Romney. Wouldn't you love to be a fly on that wall? One topic of discussion could be and include the Secretary of State job. There's been a lot of backlash since Trump began announcing his top picks because there are concerns of the apparent lack of diversity. So far, all 5 of the people who've been nominated are white men. But is that criticism fair given how early in the process we really are? So to talk about this, I'm joined by Tim Wise, author of books like Dear White America and Colorblind. Tim, thank you very much. I know we have another guest. Hopefully they'll join us as well. But Tim, let me start with you.
Okay. Sure.
There's still a long way to go in this process. And yes, we've had a couple of picks here. Do you fear about the issue of diversity based upon what we're seeing and hearing so far?
Well, I don't think the biggest issue is the diversity of the picks, because the reality is, given Donald Trump's politics and his rhetoric on the campaign trail, the odds that he's going to have, let's say, a vast array of people of color who he would hire or who even would want the jobs is probably going to be less likely. Unless he's going to appoint someone like Omarosa, the Secretary of the Treasury, he's not going to have a lot of sycophants of color. He likes to appoint people who've praised him from the very beginning, people like Jeff Sessions, et cetera. I think the bigger problem is not that it's not a diverse set of picks, it's the kind of picks that he's making. There's nothing wrong with white men in those positions, but when they are people like Jeff Sessions, who's on record as saying that he had no problem with the Ku Klux Klan until he found out they smoked weed, and someone who has a history when he was in Alabama as a U.S. attorney trying to prosecute voter fraud against civil rights heroes in that state who were trying to do nothing but ensure access to the ballot to black people, that to me is the bigger issue. The diversity itself is not the biggest problem, or the lack thereof. The bigger problem are the ideological predispositions of the people. Mike Flynn, who clearly has a history of tweeting and saying incredibly Islamophobic things about Muslims as a whole, and Steve Bannon, who says on record that there are too many Asians in Silicon Valley, and that his platform previously, Breitbart, was going to be the platform for the alt-right, a movement begun by blatant white nationalists and racists.
Okay, well, let me just join you in this conversation.
Sure.
We're talking about Jeff Sessions, I think, in particular, and some of the things he has said in the past. Yeah. Words matter, of course. But people, do we believe people can change? Do we believe people that can now see things the right way, if that's a way to put it? In other words, should he be blamed for statements that were made some time ago?
Well, people can certainly change, but not all that long ago, on the floor of the United States Congress, on the floor of the Senate, he made the comment that immigrants coming from the Dominican Republic, for instance, had nothing to offer the United States, no real skills. He singled out a very particular group of immigrants of color to bash them in terms of their skill set. Right now, there are white supremacists on Twitter and all throughout the internet who are praising his pick precisely because they see him not as a racist in the 80s or the 70s or in his youth, but as a racist now. I think someone should ask Jeff Sessions, do you today condemn the things that you said and did as a U.S. attorney? Do you condemn the statements that you made within the last few years about Dominican refugees and immigrants? Because if the answer to that is no, then I don't think we can say that that man who was 39 when he was making those comments back in the 80s or whatever it was, is truly changed. People change from the time they're teenagers and young adults. A 39-year-old man is pretty concretized in his thinking.
All right, Tim, let me stop you there just for a moment, because I understand that now Peniel Joseph has joined us. He is director of the Center for the Study of Race and Democracy and history professor at the University of Texas. Thank you, sir, very much for joining us. Glad we got you in. We're talking, of course, about diversity, or the lack of, so far, that we've seen in the Trump selections for his administration. What are your concerns?
Well, I think there's a number of concerns, and I would reiterate what the guests are saying. I think, one, we have the white nationalists who are connected to the Trump campaign through Steve Bannon and Corey Lewandowski, who was on CNN. And two, we really have the rhetoric of a neo-Confederacy with these potential administrative picks in terms of Jeff Sessions for Attorney General, Rudy Giuliani for Secretary of State. So the white nationalist rhetoric is what got Trump elected, and right now, policy-wise, we're seeing this influence the discussion of the parameters of the administration, and that's going to mean terrible things for people who are interested in ending mass incarceration, anti-poverty, racial justice, racial equality, gender justice, protection for people who are LGBTQ, and also Muslim and undocumented workers.
And so what should be done here? Is it that he finds some high-profile minority and places them in a position and says, ta-da, look? Or is it more than that? It would have to be much more than that. It's not just a showcase. And again, let me go to you, Peniel. I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. It's much more than a black face in a higher place. What you need is a substantive recognition of the way in which American democracy works. So even though African Americans only voted for him at an 8% clip, they are part of the constituency of the country. So what he needs to do is reach out to Congressional Black Caucus. He needs to reach out to African American civil rights leaders, Latino civil rights leaders. He needs to reach out to women and Planned Parenthood and include them in these discussions, because what's happening right now, even as he's saying he's president of the United States, he's really setting up a cabinet and administration that's the most conservative and far right wing, perhaps, that we've seen in history.
Mm-hmm. Tim, part of this is, of course, not just how a cabinet looks, but people of diverse backgrounds bring diverse ideas, diverse thinking, correct, into the whole mix, and that's what the president wants, diverse advice.
Of course. I mean, there's a long-standing political science theory and recognition of the problem of groupthink, and that's affected all presidential administrations. But when you have a president who is so single-minded, does not brook criticism at all of his views, likes sycophants who praise him nonstop 24 hours a day, the problem of groupthink is even stronger. He has a right to pick conservatives, but there were plenty of conservatives who were out there criticizing him from the very beginning for taking a much more white nationalist, overtly xenophobic, Islamophobic stance. So he could pick people who were Republican-leaning or even conservative by and large. I expect him to do that. That isn't the same as picking people whose rhetoric has been blatantly Islamophobic, blatantly xenophobic, or people like Rudy Giuliani who say, as Trump himself has said, we need to have stop and frisk nationwide because it works so well in New York. It did not work in New York, and since it has been eliminated in New York, crime has continued to fall. What it did was single out black folks. We don't need that in the administration. That's not the same as conservatism. That is racism.
I've got to stop it there. You make excellent points, Tim Wise and Peniel Joseph. I'm glad we were able to get you in. Isn't it always the way you get on TV and people start calling you? We're glad to have both of you in this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.